For 30 minutes on a Tuesday in May, thousands of listeners across Essex and beyond believed something that simply wasn't true, that King Charles III was dead. There was no warning, no context, no clarification. Just a solemn pre-recorded announcement, the national anthem, and then 16 minutes of unsettling silence. It sounds like the plot of a media thriller. It was actually a real broadcasting failure, and this week, the UK's media regulator released its full account of exactly how it happened. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. This is the story of how a single staff member's moment of curiosity turned into one of the most talked about broadcasting blunders in recent British history, why radio stations keep death announcements for the monarch on file in the first place, and what the official investigation revealed about the chaotic 30 minutes that followed. If you enjoy stories about the strange, human side of how the news actually gets made, stick around, and consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. On May 19th, listeners tuning into Radio Caroline, an Essex-based station with roots stretching back to Britain's pirate radio era of the 1960s, were listening to a segment of The Barry Marsh Show, a program broadcast that day from a remote location rather than the station's main studio. Because the host was off-site, his live feed was being streamed in from elsewhere and relayed to listeners over the airwaves. It was, by all accounts, an unremarkable broadcasting day. Back at Radio Caroline's studio in Essex, a staff member was carrying out routine maintenance work on one of the station's computers. In the course of that maintenance, they came across a set of audio files that most listeners would never know existed, pre-recorded obituary announcements, prepared in advance for the event of King Charles III's death. This is a far more common practice across British broadcasting than most people realize, and we'll get into exactly why a little later. For now, what matters is that these particular files existed, sitting quietly on a studio computer, waiting for a day that hadn't come. According to Radio Caroline's own account, those files came bundled with strict instructions about when and how they were permitted to be aired, guidelines meant to prevent exactly the kind of accident that was about to unfold. But instead of leaving the files alone, the staff member, out of what the station later described simply as curiosity, played them. What they may not have fully grasped in that moment was that doing so didn't just play the files locally. It interrupted the live stream coming in from the remote presenter and pushed the recordings directly out over the air, to every listener tuned in at that moment. What went out over the airwaves was not a single throwaway clip. It was a structured sequence, clearly designed to sound like a genuine, solemn news bulletin. Regular programming cut out. In its place came a formal statement announcing that regular programming was being suspended out of respect following the king's death. That was followed by a second statement, then a third, this final one going even further by claiming that news media outlets had already confirmed the king had passed away. Sandwiched into this sequence was a rendition of God Save the King, the national anthem traditionally played on British airwaves during moments of national mourning. To anyone tuning in without context, every element of what they were hearing was engineered to sound official: the formal language, the anthem, the claim of media confirmation. There was nothing to signal it was a mistake. Then came something arguably even more disorienting. After the recordings finished playing, the station simply went quiet. For roughly 16 minutes, depending on how listeners were tuning in, either dead air or a continuation of unrelated music left audiences with no clarification at all about what they'd just heard. Ofcom's later report noted that DAB digital listeners experienced the silence directly, while some AM listeners continued to hear music during that same stretch, an inconsistency that only added to the confusion depending on how people were tuned in. So how did a mistake like this go uncorrected for half an hour? The answer, according to the Ofcom investigation, comes down to a chain of very human, very ordinary lapses rather than any single catastrophic failure. The staff member who played the files, once they realized what had happened, reportedly panicked and left the studio premises entirely. That meant the person with the most direct knowledge of what had gone wrong wasn't available to explain it or help fix it. Meanwhile, the show's host, broadcasting remotely, had no idea his live feed had been cut off and replaced with a false obituary. He was reportedly on a call at the exact moment the files aired and only realized something was wrong once he noticed his own broadcast had gone silent. At the same time, back at the station, a director happened to also be on the phone when the recordings began playing, meaning the interruption wasn't caught by staff in real time either. It was only once the presenter reconnected and started looking into why his feed had dropped that the station's engineering side began investigating in parallel. The two threads, the host noticing a problem and the engineer independently investigating, eventually converged, and normal programming was restored. Roughly 30 minutes after the false announcement first aired, the host returned to the airwaves with an apology, explaining to listeners that incorrect information had been broadcast in error due to a technical issue, and that the king was, in fact, alive and well. Radio Caroline later told Ofcom that a great deal of activity was happening behind the scenes during those 30 minutes as staff scrambled to understand what had happened and get the correction on air as quickly as they reasonably could. There's a detail worth pausing on here. Radio Caroline is run largely by volunteers, a point the station emphasized in its own defense, arguing that it simply doesn't have the same layers of staffing and redundancy that a larger, commercially funded broadcaster would have on hand to catch and correct an error like this within minutes rather than half an hour. Part of what made this incident so jarring wasn't just the content of the false announcement, but the timing. At the exact moment listeners were hearing that King Charles had died, the king himself was very much alive and in the middle of official public engagements in Northern Ireland. He and Queen Camilla were beginning a multi-day visit that included stops in Belfast, meeting members of the public as part of a full, publicly documented schedule of royal engagements. That real-time contradiction is actually part of how the false report unraveled so quickly once people started checking. Some listeners, understandably alarmed, reportedly reached out to family and neighbors before verifying the claim elsewhere. But because the king was actively out in public that same day, with photographs and reports of his engagement circulating through ordinary news channels, it didn't take long for anyone checking a second source to realize something didn't add up. Within a short window, the panic that could have spread much further was largely contained simply because the actual, real king was visibly out and about, undermining the false report almost as fast as it went out. This week, Ofcom, the UK's communications regulator responsible for policing broadcasting standards, published the results of its investigation into the incident, and it makes for a genuinely detailed read. The regulator concluded that Radio Caroline had breached two separate rules under the Broadcasting Code. The first requires that news, no matter the format it's delivered in, be reported with due accuracy and due impartiality. The second requires that when a significant mistake does make it to air, it needs to be acknowledged and corrected quickly, and scheduled appropriately once it is corrected. Ofcom didn't treat this as a minor technical slip either. The regulator specifically described the false announcement as a very significant inaccuracy involving a matter of considerable public importance, language that reflects just how seriously the watchdog takes any false reporting connected to the monarch's health or life, given how much public interest and, frankly, public trust hinges on that kind of news being accurate. The investigation also filled in a detail that Radio Caroline's initial public explanation had left out. When the story first broke, the station reportedly described what happened simply as a computer error, a vague, almost accidental sounding explanation. Ofcom's fuller account made clear that this wasn't a random glitch or malfunction. A staff member had deliberately selected and played the files themselves, apparently without understanding that doing so would push the content live to the station's actual broadcast signal rather than simply playing it back locally for review. In the wake of the investigation, Radio Caroline outlined the steps it had taken to prevent a repeat of the incident. The staff member responsible for playing the files was reprimanded, and the station said that individual had since apologized for the mistake. More concretely, the sensitive pre-recorded files themselves were relocated, moved off the shared system where they'd been discovered during routine maintenance and onto a more restricted setup, specifically to prevent this kind of accidental access from happening again. For context on scale, Ofcom noted that it had received 2 formal complaints about the broadcast, a relatively small number given how alarming the content was, though complaint volume isn't necessarily a full measure of how many listeners were affected or unsettled by what they heard in the moment. If your first reaction to this story is surprise that a radio station would have pre-written obituary material for a living monarch sitting on a studio computer at all, you're not alone, but the practice itself is actually completely standard across British broadcasting, and for understandable reasons. When a figure of major national significance, a head of state, a former prime minister, a member of the royal family, dies, broadcasters are expected to respond within minutes, not hours. Scrambling to write, record, and format a respectful, accurate announcement from scratch in the moment simply isn't realistic if you want to get it right and get it out quickly. So instead, major broadcasters, and apparently smaller volunteer-run ones like Radio Caroline 2, prepare that material well in advance. Statements, sometimes accompanying music or the national anthem, formatted and ready to go the moment an official announcement is made. This kind of advance planning around the eventual death of the monarch isn't limited to radio stations either. It's long been publicly reported that the UK government and various institutions maintain detailed, rehearsed protocols for exactly this scenario, contingency planning that spans everything from official government communications to how television broadcasters would adjust their schedules. The existence of this kind of preparation isn't controversial or secretive in itself. It's considered responsible planning for an eventuality that will, someday, actually happen. What makes the Radio Caroline incident notable isn't that the files existed. It's that the safeguards meant to keep them from being played prematurely, described by the station itself as a set of strict instructions for presenters and managers, weren't enough to stop one curious staff member from accessing and airing them outside of any real context. As uncomfortable as this incident clearly was, it's also not without precedent. Media organizations have accidentally published or aired premature death reports before, usually for very similar reasons. Pre-prepared material meant for a future event getting released, published, or broadcast well ahead of schedule, usually through some combination of human error and inadequate safeguards around sensitive files. One of the more widely remembered examples happened in the mid-2000s, when a major financial news wire accidentally published a fully prepared obituary for a prominent technology executive who was, at the time, still alive, material that had clearly been drafted in advance in anticipation of a health-related death that hadn't yet occurred. In another well-known case from the early 2000s, a major news outlet's website briefly and accidentally exposed a whole folder of pre-written obituaries for a range of major public figures, several of whom were, at the time, in good health, after the material wasn't properly secured behind the outlet's normal editorial safeguards. These incidents tend to share a common thread with what happened at Radio Caroline. They're rarely the result of malicious intent or even a single catastrophic failure. They're usually the product of ordinary, sensitive preparation material not being sufficiently locked down, combined with an unlucky moment of human access or error that lets it slip out into public view before it was ever supposed to. Stepping back, this story sits at an interesting intersection of a few different things: the very real, if slightly uncomfortable, logistics of how broadcasters prepare for major national news events, the vulnerabilities that come with keeping sensitive material on shared or accessible systems, and the outsized public reaction that any news, real or false, connected to the monarch's health and life reliably generates in Britain. It's also, in its own way, a reminder of how quickly false information, delivered with the right tone and formatting, can be mistaken for something official and true. The Radio Caroline announcement worked, in the sense that it briefly convinced real listeners, precisely because it sounded exactly like what a genuine announcement would sound like. Formal language, the national anthem, a claim that other media had already confirmed the news. Strip away the fact that it happened by accident, and it's a fairly stark illustration of how much weight audiences place on tone and format when deciding whether to trust what they're hearing. For Radio Caroline, a station with a genuinely storied history dating back to its origins as one of Britain's original unlicensed offshore stations in the 1960s, this incident represents a rare and clearly unwelcome brush with the kind of national headline attention usually reserved for much larger broadcasters. The station has said it's taken the matter seriously, reprimanded the staff member responsible, and moved the sensitive files to a more secure location. Whether that's enough to satisfy Ofcom and the listening public going forward likely depends on whether anything similar happens again. In the end, nobody was harmed. The king remained, as he had been the entire time, very much alive and going about a full schedule of public engagements. But for 30 unsettling minutes in May, a routine maintenance check turned into national news, a reminder of just how fragile the line can be between carefully prepared contingency planning and a genuinely convincing, entirely false broadcast. It's a strange little story, equal parts human error, institutional preparation, and the sheer unpredictability of live broadcasting, and it's exactly the kind of behind-the-scenes media mishap that rarely gets this much official scrutiny. Now that Ofcom's investigation has laid out exactly what happened, we finally have the full picture of how a single moment of curiosity turned into one of the more bizarre broadcasting corrections in recent memory. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the strange side of how news actually gets made, let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more